Well, hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to tonight's program, A History of American Christmas Cookies. My name is Krista. I'll be your librarian host tonight from the Poughkeepsie Public Library District. And please join me in welcoming Sarah Wassberg Johnson, also known as the food historian, who'll be giving tonight's talk. So just a couple of quick housekeeping things before we get going. You are muted during tonight's program, so no mics and no cameras on, please. If you do have any questions or comments you'd like to make, please utilize the chat box on the bottom of your screen, and Sarah will try her best to answer those questions. If you enjoyed tonight's program, please check out the library's website, poklib.org. You can go to our events calendar and see all the other programs we have going on throughout the end of December. And we also have just released our January and February calendar. So you can also see what's going on coming up. And our registration for that will open on December 19th. If you live in the Poughkeepsie area, you should have gotten our printed rotunda in your mailboxes this week. And if you didn't, you can always go to any of the branches and pick up a copy as well to see what we have coming up in 2023. Tonight's program is being recorded, so if you do have to leave a little bit early or you want to watch it again at a later date, we will have that video up on the library's YouTube page shortly. I'll also email everybody a link to that video when I have it. So just check out your email probably in the next week or two, and we'll have that video ready for you. I think that's all I have to say. Before I pass along to Sarah, though, if you do have any technical issues with your sound or your video, you can reach out to me directly in the chat. I'll be watching along with you all. But that's it. I'm going to pass it to Sarah. Enjoy, everybody, and see you at the end.
Thanks, Krista. All right, give me a minute, folks, while I share my screen. Come on. Here we go. Okay. So welcome everybody to tonight's talk. I'm realizing I just match the talk background perfectly. That was not planned, but that's a great coincidence. So today we're going to be talking all about Christmas cookies, right? So the title of the talk is Koekje, Cookie or Cookie, A History of American Christmas Cookies. And so I thought we would start by talking about what is a cookie and how do cookies develop? So our earliest ancestors of cookies are unleavened hard bread, right? So all the grain producing cultures in the world have some sort of unleavened baked good made from flour made from these grains. Most of our cookie origins come from the Middle East and Europe. So really the first version of what we might consider a cookie today came from the Persians around 700 CE. They started adding sugar to their baked goods. Sugar cane is native to India, and the Persians started a trade relationship with India in the 700s. And so they're the first people to be adding sugar to it. But cookies as a trend, I guess a culinary trend, really don't take off until we get to the medieval period, largely in Europe. They're likely introduced to Europe through the Moorish invasion of Spain. So that is Arab people coming over from North Africa into Spain. Charlemagne famously, prevents them from invading France. And then also the Crusades is a real time of Northern Europeans learning a lot of the science, math, technology, and also culinary skills of the Middle East. So some of these early spices that are maybe very familiar, spice and flavoring that are very familiar around Christmas time. Some of the earliest ones are ginger, black pepper, cinnamon, and saffron, which are coming from Arab traders along the Silk Road. And then more locally, we have wine and almonds and dried fruits from the Mediterranean. And then more locally in Northern Europe, we have honey, anise, and caraway. Those are really our primary spices that we're using, flavorings we're using to flavor cookies, really until the 16th century. There is a little bit of overlap. 16th century is the 1500s. In the Renaissance period, Venice was really the center of the spice trade for Europe. really coming through these Arab traders going overland through the Silk Road. Some other European countries, particularly Spain and Portugal, and later the Netherlands and England, wanted to bypass that trade. So they start going by ship directly to the Spice Islands, directly to India, you know, kind of the Asian subcontinent. And for sure, by the time we get to the 1600s, there's a lot of conflict, a fair amount of brutality, but Europeans end up controlling the Spice Islands, and that makes spices much more affordable and much more prevalent in Europe at that time. So we have nutmeg and mace coming from the Spice Islands, which is part of Indonesia. Cloves, allspice, comes from the Caribbean. And then, of course, we also have sugar. Prior to the 16th century, sugar was a fairly scarce and expensive ingredient. But in the 16th century, we get the development of plantation culture in the Caribbean. We have Dutch, English, Portuguese, Spanish, French holdings in the Caribbean, fueled by the slave trade, the West African slave trade. So sugar, thanks to the slave trade, becomes much more affordable and much more prevalent than it was earlier. So why do we associate cookies with Christmas, right? Why is there this connection? A big reason why is because historically cookies were a sign of wealth, right? They're a luxury item, not only because of the ingredients, right, which are sometimes fairly rare, honey and sugar, butter is rare in the wintertime, white flour was very difficult to produce historically. Nuts, eggs, not necessarily readily available, especially if you're using imported nuts, and spices in particular being quite expensive in the medieval period. It's really not until the 19th century that spices become affordable enough that they're ubiquitous. Cookies are also historically very difficult to bake, right? So nowadays we can just go into the kitchen and turn on our electric or gas ovens. We have all the equipment. They're really easy to make. Maybe the ingredients are the expensive part still these days, but otherwise they're easy to make. Now try thinking about making cookies over an open fire. Like, we don't really make cookies when we go camping for a reason, because they're difficult to produce in an open hearth. And I'll talk a little bit about how people did make them in a bit. And then they become associated with Christmas because in the Christian calendar, Christmas is a big feast, right? In the medieval period, the weeks leading up to Christmas were actually a time of fasting. And then from Christmas through to 12th night, or depending on the country, even beyond, was a time of rest, relaxation, feasting. You're eating your richest foods in terms of calories. You're eating, you're trying to show off to your neighbors. You're really expending as much wealth as you can afford to make the season special. And cookies, because they're this luxury item at this time period, and because spices are a luxury item, sugar is a luxury item, all of these things kind of coalesce into giving us cookies at Christmas time. So baking, I talked a little bit about baking being difficult in the period. So historically, cookies, you needed a bake oven to make them, right? You can make cookies in like a Dutch oven, but you really only make a couple at a time. So it's not very conducive to baking. Also, baking historically, cookies were a little bit different than we think of them today, which I'll get to in a minute. I also will explain bake ovens. I have a picture in a second. Cookies also needed a lot of equipment, right? Most cookies were made with molds. The cookie cutters like this one come a little bit later, more 18th and 19th century. So historically they used cookie molds. The sweeteners are not only difficult to obtain, but you need a lot of it to make cookies, right? Otherwise the texture is not necessarily correct. So there's some ratio issues with sweeteners. Historically, also sugar did not come pre-granulated. It came in a hard cone that you had to use these clippers sugar nips to get off pieces, and then you had to pound it in a mortar and pestle to get the fine powder. So if you ever see historic recipes that call for powdered sugar, they're not necessarily referring to confectioner's sugar. They're referring to really you just are pounding a hard piece of sugar until it's granulated, right? You need tin sheets to bake them on. Unlike bread, you can't just put cookies on the floor of the bake oven or they'll break when you try to take them out or they'll burn. You need a tin sheet. And so wealthy households had access to all of these things. They had bake ovens, they had equipment, they had professionals doing the job. Your average household, particularly in Europe, did not have bake ovens in their homes really until the 18th or 19th centuries. And it depended on the wealth of the person. Middle-class people, probably lower-class people, peasant farmers, poor people in urban areas might not even have really a kitchen, much less access to a bake oven. You did have a village baker historically from the medieval period on. And particularly in Christian and Jewish traditions, when you are not supposed to cook on the Sabbath, people would bring their meals to the village baker on the evening before the Sabbath, and the baker would shut them up in the bake oven at the end of the day, and they would cook overnight, kind of like our slow cookers do today. And I'll explain why that's a thing in just a second. And so because of this, you get the development of professional bakers, particularly in urban areas where there's relatively high demand. So you get professional bakers working in households, but then also having a business, right, where they are baking for the public. So this is a bake oven. This is an illustration of a medieval style bake oven. This is obviously either for a monastery or a wealthy household because it is quite large. You maybe have seen bake ovens in colonial era historic houses in the United States that are much smaller than this. So this is for a large household. They are baking bread. And I'll explain how it works. So you have this large masonry structure that's hollow. And what you do is you build a fire inside of it to preheat your bake oven. When it's hot enough, you rake out the coals, and there's no chimney. So the smoke just comes up the front. There's usually a chimney or some kind of hole up at the top for the smoke to go out. You rake the coals out, which is what these are here. This is the flame and the coals raked out of the oven. And then you, using this long wooden peel, put your bread or whatever else you need in there. Now, they're probably cooking this fairly quickly, so they're not putting a door on it. But you would have had a door that lifted off that you could put on it if you needed to bake something for longer. And the oven would cool as you're going, right? So you need to have everything you need to cook ready to go in order. So you can put the things that need a really hot or quick oven first, and then the things that need, like a medium oven and then a slow oven, particularly at the end of the day, that needs longer to cook over a long period of time at a lower temperature. You're going to put that in at the end of the day and shut the door. So historically, anything about open hearth cooking or bake ovens in colonial America, often the last thing to go in was a pot of beans or a pot of stew or something that's going to cook very slowly over a long period of time. And then it's, ready in the morning when it's just kind of residually warm, right? So bake ovens like this, obviously designed for baking things like bread. You could also bake cakes in them, although that's a little more difficult. And then the cookies, you'd have to have special equipment like a tin sheet and all sorts of other things to bake them. A little bit about shaping cookies. That's what also makes cookies a little bit different from some of our other confections, right? They have all these interesting shapes. Cookie molds date back to the medieval period. Cookie cutters to the 15th century, but really not widely popular until the 19th century. A lot of historic recipes, they might call for you to cut them in shapes, but they don't tell you how to do it. A lot of times it's just maybe like with a knife if you're cutting it into strips or diamonds. But in the 19th century, the use of cookie cutters really explodes. This is an illustration from a patent application from the 1870s by an African-American inventor. And it says biscuit cutter. And the patent doesn't explain exactly what they mean by biscuit cutter, but as you may have read in the description for this talk, there's some discrepancy in terminology, right? So in the UK, biscuits are what we call cookies. And that term, in addition to the word cracker, were used kind of interchangeably in the 19th century to mean a crisp little sweetened cake, right? So this could very well be what we think of today as Southern style, fluffy baking powder and buttermilk raised biscuits, right? And he's cutting them into fancy shapes for catering is the theory. But if you've ever tried to cut biscuits out with a cutter, you know it's not always easy to get them back out. So I don't know how efficient this would be if you're having to pull all the biscuits out of these cutters. I think it might be for rolled cookie dough. That's just a theory. But I wanted to include this because it says biscuit and because we know that terminology was in use to describe cookies in the 19th century. We do also get the development of cookie presses, so like extruded cookies, right? That really dates back to the 16th century. It doesn't become super popular until we get the development of Miro Aluminum Company invents the cookie gun in the 1930s. And then for sure, post-war 1950s, 60s, cookie presses, cookie guns become hugely popular after World War II, when people are not having to ration sugar and butter anymore, right? And we'll talk about the style of cookie that uses a cookie gun or a cookie press a little bit later in the talk. So I talked a little bit about terminology, right? We mentioned that the British say biscuit and Americans say cookie. So why is that? Where does that come from? Well, it has to do with what other culture you were introduced to cookies from. So for the Brits, that's the French, right? Biscuit, biscuit, right, is cooked twice from the Latin, very similar to Italian biscotti, which is actually cooked twice, unlike French biscuit and British biscuits are not necessarily cooked twice. But the Americans, we say cookie. Where the heck does that word come from? Well, if you know anything about New York history, you know that we were once a Dutch colony. So our word cookie comes from the Dutch word koekje, which means a small cake. So koek is cake, and je, the J-E addition at the end in Dutch is like a diminutive. So a koek is a cake, and a koekje is a little cake or a small cake. This kind of terminology persists in a couple of other languages. In Norwegian and a lot of the Scandinavian languages, they use some variants of small kokker, which literally means small cakes. The only one, even the etymologist didn't know, was the Spanish. The Spanish word for cookie is galleta, and we don't know where that comes from or why they use it, and not some variant on the other Latin biscuits twice cooked. And then the Germans say Plätzchen, which is a little confusing because it's a diminutive. It means a small place, but Platz means a round, flat cake. So again, Chen in German is a diminutive, so Plätzchen or Plätzchen is a small cake. And then the spelling, I was curious about the spelling. This is a Google Ngram. If you've never done them, they're super fun. It searches all the published materials that have been digitized by Google Books from 1800 to the present. And so I wanted to look at all the possible variations of the spelling of cookie, right? So I didn't go all the way up to the present, because if we did, this blue line would have been off the charts and you would not have even been able to see these other lines. But you can see there's a fair amount of variation for most of the 19th century. This little bump in the 18 teens for cookie with an EE, I think might be referring to someone who is a cook. So there's always, you got to kind of figure out what your terminology means, right? But cookie with a Y and even cookie with an EY gets a little bump in the 1840s, right? But it's really cookie with an IE and Cooky with a Y that are kind of neck and neck here until we get to the 1920s. And Cooky with a Y persists, particularly in the early, like the 1930s, but then IE just takes off and that becomes the standard spelling. Talked a little bit about New Netherland, right? So why do we get cookies from the Dutch? We're a Dutch colony for a relatively short period of time. And cookies in Dutch culture at the time were associated with funerals and New Year's Day. The Dutch were Calvinists. The Dutch Reformed Church is Calvinist, just like the Puritans and the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims actually spent over a decade in the Netherlands before they came to the United States. And I found out recently that they were originally aiming for New York or New Netherland at the time when they wind up on Cape Cod. So just some interesting, twists of fate. What would life in the United States have been like if they had ended up in the Netherlands instead? But because they're Calvinists, they consider celebrations of Christmas too associated with Catholicism and paganism. But really only about 20 to 30% of Dutch residents were enrolled members of the church, even though the Dutch Reformed Church is the official state church. They did not have as much control over the populace as I think they would have liked to. So they do celebrate Christmas. They did celebrate Christmas historically, but it was kind of frowned upon. Cookies were mostly associated with funerals and New Year's Day. And you might say, Sarah, funerals? Why are we eating cookies at funerals? Well, part of it is it has to do with that wealth and kind of showing off to people your wealth at a funeral. Today we do it with flowers and expensive coffins. Historically, they did it with cookies. And it was also for people to have kind of like a souvenir, right, of going to the funeral. Same thing with cake, with weddings. In early America, you took home a slice of cake as a souvenir. With funerals, it was cookies. Our first print reference to cookie, the actual Americanized spelling rather than the Dutch, comes from 1703. And it is in reference to a funeral. But the Dutch do, even though they celebrate Christmas, it's not as big of a deal. Their big day that is associated with cookies around Christmas time is St. Nicholas Day, which was just a little while ago. It's usually December 6th, and it's either St. Nicholas Eve, December 5th, is when St. Nicholas or Sinterklaas comes to visit, and he brings with him a speculous cookie, is usually one of his gifts. So there's this great illustration I found from the 1850s of Sinterklaas in his, bishop's outfit, delivering this giant speculous cookie to this totally delighted and surprised boy, right? So speculoos are a cinnamon, kind of like a cinnamon style gingerbread cookie, very crisp, very delicious. If you've ever had Biscotti, you have had speculoos. So our other big historic Christmas cookie is gingerbread, right? And all of our European countries tend to have some variation on this, particularly the northern countries. Dates back to medieval Europe. A friend of mine, Neil DiMarino, is also a food historian. He runs something called the Georgian Kitchen, in reference to Georgian England, not the state or country of Georgia. And he's done a lot of research on gingerbread, and I actually got to try a 14th century recipe because of him. He specializes in recreating historic recipes as accurately as possible. And he did a whole program on gingerbread, which I think might be online somewhere. And the earliest recipe he could find dates back to the 14th century, which is the 1300s. And the recipe is you steep ginger in honey and then strain it and then mix it with breadcrumbs. And that's your gingerbread. It's kind of like a medieval cake pop, like a crunchy cake pop in texture. It's not my favorite unless you really love honey. It's not necessarily going to appeal to you. I much prefer the more recent variants on gingerbread, particularly gingerbread cake. I don't mind gingerbread cookies, those are good, but gingerbread cake is really delicious too. Also in medieval Europe, because we're kind of predating parts of the spice trade, most of our spices in gingerbread are just ginger, but you do also see a lot of black pepper. And even if that doesn't persist in the recipes, you see it in the names. So we have Sephronusa, right? Pepper nuts. Pepparkakor, which are Swedish, literally pepper cakes. And then our first reference to gingerbread men comes from Queen Elizabeth I. She threw a banquet. She had her bakers make carved molds of some of the people who were attending the banquet and bake them into gingerbread. So they were men, literal men, made out of gingerbread. Historically, the molds were quite elaborate like this one. They were wooden. Sometimes you would see pewter or silver. Mostly they were wooden molds. This one's from the 18th century, so quite a bit later. But it was traditional to have this very fine detail. And of course, they're a relief mold. Like this is carved into the wood. You put the dough in it, and then when you take it out, it's a relief of whatever is carved into there. I talked a little bit about professional bakers, right? That is who is making gingerbread historically throughout Europe. People are not necessarily making it at home, again, because they don't have access to the equipment, particularly the ovens necessary to make cookies. So this is a church fair, and there's a stall selling gingerbread. You can see everybody is all gathered around, and they have gingerbread pictured here. The heart shape, some other shapes, the heart shapes, these big green things in the middle, that's candied fruit, probably citron, which is why it's green. And gingerbread had a lot of lore associated with it, right? You would eat or purchase gingerbread kind of based on what you were hoping for, either for Christmas or the new year. So hearts are for love. Obviously, you might buy a house. If you wanted a house, if you're a young woman, you might be a gingerbread man because you're looking for a husband, you know, that kind of stuff. So there's all sorts of fun lore associated with that. So we talked a little bit about our Dutch colonial influence. What's our British colonial influence? There is a lot when it comes to Christmas, but cookies are not necessarily one of them. The British have a way different food and dessert traditions than most of the other countries. They are much more concerned with other desserts like Christmas pudding, mince pie, fruit cake. The classic fruit cake is still very popular in the UK. There are only two cookies that they have, and those aren't necessarily associated just with Christmas, but they do have gingerbread and they do have shortbread, right? And in the United States, we have influence from a lot of different immigrant communities, but our primary concept of Christmas today comes from the Victorian period. So Queen Victoria and her husband, her German husband, Prince Albert, really popularized the Christmas tree, which was not used outside of German households prior to the mid-19th century. And they popularized a number of other of our traditions, you know, the Christmas pudding. Some of the other ones don't come over, like Christmas crackers, and other British traditions that are different from the United States don't translate. But the Christmas tree, gingerbread, shortbread, things like that are big influences thanks to Victoria. So you may have read in my little notes there, I talked about Stir About Sunday. The Christmas pudding is so important historically to British households that they have a whole day set aside a couple of weeks before Christmas called Stir About or Stir It Up Sunday, where, you know, the household cook. In a smaller household, it might be the mother, but in bigger households like this one, it's a professional, puts the Christmas pudding together so it has time to age, right? Usually for the alcohol to soak in to the fruit before you steam it or bake it, depending on how you're cooking it. But every member of the household has to give it a stir and make a wish, and it's like this tradition that then when you eat the pudding, your wish will come true, that kind of fun stuff. Don't know where it came from. But people even today still do Stir About Sunday. So our other UK popular cookie is shortbread, but although they are from the UK, they are not from England, right? Shortbread is inherently Scottish. Our first recorded references to shortbread date to the 12th century. so the 1100s, so it's been around for a long time. But it's really not until the 17th century, the 1600s, that it really starts to take off in Scotland. The 1500s were not a good time for Scotland. They had plague, they were not doing well economically. But in the 1600s to 17th century, they start trade agreements with England, right? Their wars are kind of over. So they have access to English markets, which not only gives them access to things like sugar and, wheat, flour, but also gives them an outlet for their main export, which is dairy cattle. So this is kind of combining to give us ample access to flour, sugar, and butter, which are our primary ingredients in shortbread. That's my dog, if anybody hears that noise. Supposedly, shortbread was Mary Queen of Scots' favorite, so she helped popularize it, right? Her sister Elizabeth has the whole gingerbread market cornered. Apparently, Mary was super into shortbread. And then, of course, our ultimate tastemaker, Queen Victoria, helps popularize it through her Scottish obsession, right? She has Balmoral. You get tartan, really starts to come to the fore, and shortbread is part of that. If you're a big fan of Martha Stewart in the 90s and 2000s, you know that she was super into vintage Scottish shortbread molds for a while. So we have molded gingerbread. Shortbread was also molded. This is a very Scottish mold with the, thistle, symbol of Scotland. Scottish shortbread is traditionally cut into wedges like this. If you didn't have a mold, sometimes you'll see it's just like little fork pricks on it and then cut into wedges. But they did have these more elaborate molds as well. So that brings us back to the United States, right? We talked about Queen Vicky and her influence, but there's a lot else going on in the United States that's influencing why cookies become so much more popular here than they are maybe in other countries. One is that the average American, particularly the average free white American, has way more access to wealth and resources than their European counterparts. It's why you see a lot of European immigration, basically all the overpopulation of Europe. The United States is the outlet for that overpopulation. And we also have a lot more access to labor, particularly through enslavement, right? You did not have large numbers of enslaved people in Europe. Europe mostly used their enslaved population in the colonies. The United States, particularly in the 19th century, is one of the few free countries in the world to have a huge population of enslaved people locally. And particularly with sugar production, that has a big impact on what ordinary Americans are able to afford. We also have a rise of caterers and professional bakers, particularly in urban areas. So that gives even middle-class people who might have a bake oven like this one, which you see is much more modestly sized than that big medieval one. Even if you have access to a bake oven, you might not be as skilled as a professional. So it might just be easier and more effective for you to purchase from a professional if you live in an urban area. We also have a huge influx of immigration in the late 19th and the late 18th and particularly the 19th into the 20th century. That's part of our labor accessibility, right? We have huge numbers of immigrants coming in and providing low cost labor, right? Even to the average person. So with them come their Christmas traditions. And so the United States, because white America did not have an established long-standing tradition like Europe did, it was much more open to this kind of confluence of ideas and traditions that really are what end up shaping what Christmas is like today. So just a brief overview of our waves of immigration by time period. In the 18th and 19th century, most of our immigrants are coming from continental Europe. English, Dutch, Spanish, Scottish, a little bit of Irish, a little bit of French, and then a lot of people fleeing religious persecution, right? So we have Moravians, French Huguenots, Belgian Walloons, Palatine Germans, separatists like the Pilgrims, things like that. In the early 19th century, our two biggest groups of immigrants are Germans and Irish. And then, of course, domestic immigration with westward expansion. The latter half of the 19th century, we're expanding a little bit. We have Irish, Scandinavians, Italians, Bohemians, Middle Easterners, Eastern Europeans, and Chinese. The Middle Easterners, particularly coming out of Syria. There were a number of economic disasters in Syria in the late 19th century. The 20th century, we have Russians and Eastern Europeans, especially Russian and Polish Jews that are fleeing pogroms. And then we also have more people coming from the Mediterranean, Greeks, Lebanese, Syrians, and then to a lesser extent, on the West Coast, we have Japanese. So those are kind of our biggest groups that are coming in. Obviously, we're having immigration from all over the world at this time, but these are our biggest groups. So one of our earliest and probably most influential on Christmas cookies is the Moravians. You may have heard of the Moravian star, right, which is pictured here. That's probably what they're most famous for, but cookies is their other thing they're most famous for. So Moravians are one of our first Protestant churches. They're founded in the Czech Republic about 40 years before Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the door. And they are the first Protestant sect to send missionaries out in the world. Obviously, the Catholic Church has had missionaries for hundreds of years by this point, but they're the first Protestant sect to send missionaries. And their first mission is in Dutchess County in 1740. They are ministering to the Mohican people, and they are expelled by the New York colonial government in 1744 because they're worried that they are riling up the native population in the years leading up to the French and Indian War. So they settle in Pennsylvania. Another group settles in New Salem, North Carolina. Always forget which state it's in. And they have a big cookie tradition. So they are known for spice cookies. They're known for molasses cookies, and especially sugar cookies. And I really think that the Moravians are where our American sugar cookie tradition comes from, because our sugar cookies are not really shortbread, and they're not really, some of the other traditional sugar cookies. They're kind of their own thing. And I think our closest ancestor is Moravian sugar cookies. So today, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania is known as like the Christmas capital of the world. And New Salem is known, they have, Moravian cookie shops everywhere. So that's one of our earliest influences on what we're making for Christmas cookies and how. The Germans, obviously, huge influence on cookie making. They have some of the earliest innovations in gingerbread, which is what this guy is making here, these beautiful molded gingerbreads. And you can see he's got this big bake oven and his peel in his arm. So Lebkuchen, which is basically German gingerbread, dates back to 1296 is the first recorded reference to it in Ulm, Germany. Springerle dates back to 14th century Swabia. Zimsterne to the 17th century, Sephronusa to the 1750s. And the Palatine Germans are probably the first Germans to come to what becomes the United States and bring cookie traditions with them. And then, of course, we also have the Pennsylvania Deutsch, right? So they are German-speaking groups, usually also fleeing religious persecution, settling in Pennsylvania, and probably maybe doing a little mixing with the Moravians, right? And then, of course, in the 19th century, we have Victoria and Albert popularizing some of our German traditions, largely the Christmas tree, but some gingerbread and other cookie traditions become more popular because they make it more socially acceptable for non-Germans to celebrate using German Christmas traditions. Just a fun little postcard from Germany from the turn of the 20th century showing some of these traditional foods. There's gingerbread with the green candied fruit. Some gingerbread has chocolate frosting. There's some other kind of cookies here. There's these fruit cakes here in the corner, and then nuts and fruit are also very traditional Christmas treats throughout continental Europe. Spring Early are a very interesting cookie. I have a couple of recipes here. These are all from American cookbooks, or in this case, the Boston Cooking School magazine, American Cookery. Spring Early are a very unique treat in large part because they have these molds. Sometimes you will also see rolling pins with the molds on them, but these straight wooden molds are also common. And they are very light, kind of almost like a chewy macaroon style texture, made of eggs, and then they are have aniseed on the bottom. So they are anise and lemon flavored. So this is like our traditional paragraph style recipe. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but I found another recipe which is a little bit simpler to read. And you can, I love this. It says stir eggs and sugar for 3/4 of an hour. So beating eggs and sugar by hand, it says stir, but they really mean beat it by hand for 45 minutes, or beat it to light with a Dover beater, which is, you know, the crank style egg beater. And again, they're flavored with lemon and aniseed. Here's a modern image of them with some modern molds. You can see how white they are. So different maybe from what we associate with Christmas cookies today, but you can also see how fine the relief is from these molds and how pretty they are. Lebkuchen, I have 2 recipes here. This is number 1 and there is a number 2. The number 1 is pretty simple. It's flavored with cinnamon and citron, which is a type of citrus fruit that is prized for its rind. It doesn't actually have a lot of fruit in it, but it's the rind for candying, and also because it has the very fragrant smell and flavor to it. So yeah, flavored with cinnamon, citron, and then it has almonds in it. Number 2 is a little more complicated. It still has citron and cinnamon, but it also has these other spices, orange peel and chocolate, right? And both of them are frosted. They can have frosting on them. And this is probably what it would have looked like. These are modern Lebkuchen from Germany. So here we have, you know, Santa Claus, however you want to call him, St. Nicholas. And then some hearts, you know, and then also some crazy stuff like bells and a candle holder, right? So these are all professionally decorated gingerbread cookies that people are buying in Christmas markets. Sephronusa, I love this one. I had to include it because it's so American, right? We're calling for New Orleans molasses. The Germans really love to put lemon in their Christmas cookies, I discovered when I started looking at a lot of these recipes. So this is cinnamon and cloves, again with the citron, again with lemon flavoring, although you can leave the almonds and citron out, which again is probably an American thing. Like if you cannot find them or they're too expensive, you can leave them out. Cinnamon stars, this is from The Joy of Cooking. So if you have that and someone in your life is gluten-free, this is a great cookie to make for them. It is almonds and egg whites, cinnamon and lemon, again with the lemon and sugar. And they're traditionally cut into star shapes. So that's why they're called cinnamon stars. And I love this. Deservedly one of the most popular Christmas cakes. I've never had one, so I think I need to find myself some ground unblanched almonds and try it. Our other really influential group when it comes to Christmas cookies is the Italians. I couldn't find as much on the specific history of these cookies. They're known for all sorts of cookies, including, you know, like their traditional butter cookies, but these were some of the more unique ones directly associated with Christmas. The first is pizzelles, which are these beautiful crisp pressed wafers, and they're pressed on irons that have these really intricate designs. Often they're flavored with anise. Sometimes they're just plain, you know, butter sugar flavor. But they're a very crisp cookie, really unique look to them. They're usually quite large. So if you see them in stores, give them a try. Obviously, classic biscotti, right? Twice baked, the only biscuit that's actually twice baked. I have the word rusks here because that's the English word for twice baked cookies. They come in a million flavors. Most people love them with coffee or espresso. Amaretti, these are one of my favorites. They're these chewy almond cookies. You know, this Almonds, egg whites, and sugar is a theme when it comes to European cookies. This is the Italian version. Agnetti, these are super popular in Italian-American communities. They're a white, sometimes more cakey cookie flavored with anise. They're usually frosted, and in the United States, they have rainbow sprinkles on them, right? Either little dragées or actual sprinkles on top. If you don't like anise, these will fake you out because you think they're these cute little frosted sugar cookies, and then you take a bite and you're like, oh, that's not the flavor I was expecting. Strafoli, I included these because I just think they're fascinating. They're like these little balls of fried dough that are then, held together with honey, basically. So not quite a cookie, but I think they're cookies, so I'm including them. And then my personal favorite, these are one of my favorite cookies of all time, is the tricolore or rainbow cookies. Layers of tinted almond sponge with apricot and raspberry jam, and then usually enrobed in chocolate and sliced, right? So you could see the layers. So these are a distinctly Italian-American cookie, invented in the United States in the 1870s in support of Italian unification, right? Prior to the 1870s, Italy was a whole bunch of city-states. They unified into one nation, Italy, and tricolore, that's the name of their flag, right? The red, white, and green Italian flag. And so these cookies were supposed to mimic the colors of the Italian flag. They were so popular that Jewish delis in New York started also making them and calling them rainbow cookies. And then once Italy unified, it was less about the tricolore and rara Italy and more about how delicious these cookies are. And so they just called them rainbow cookies. So just a couple pictures in case you forgot what biscotti looked like, but I also wanted to include this because you can see how the cookies are shaped into these long loaves and then sliced and then baked again, right, to get them really dry and crisp. Our last immigrant group we're going to talk about is near and dear to my heart because I am 100% Scandinavian and I grew up eating a lot of these cookies. So pepparkakor I had to have first. That's largely Swedish, although you will find it in other countries. It's a very thin, very highly spiced, crisp ginger cookie, usually in heart or star shapes, or just plain round. If you've ever had Anna's Swedish ginger cookies, that's close. It's pepparkakor, but they're not very good pepparkakor. I don't think they're okay. Homemade is way better. My grandmother used to roll them out so thin. I don't know if she was going for a record or what, but in my family, we had a tradition. If you got a heart-shaped one, you're supposed to put the heart shape in your palm, the cookie in your palm, and press in the center. And if it broke into like 3 equal parts, then you could make a wish, right? So that was the tradition in my family. They are one of the only Christmas cookies actually spiced with black pepper, and they give it a very distinct spicy flavor, which I love. So if you like gingerbread, put black pepper in your gingerbread next time. You won't be sad. Spritz, which some people think are German because the word Spritz in German means to squirt, right? Debatable if the Scandinavians introduced them to the Germans or vice versa, but definitely they get introduced to the United States through our Scandinavian immigrant population. They're very buttery and the dough is super soft, which is why you have to use a cookie press, right, to make the shape. Sometimes they're called wreath cookies or S cookies, right, and they use the cookie press to make them. Fatiman are a very interesting one that even few Scandinavians have ever tried because they are deep fried. They're usually cut into strips, right, into little rectangles, and then a slit cut in the middle, and then it's flipped through, and then they're deep fried. Kruimkake, which is what's pictured here, very similar to pizzelles, except for much thinner. Excuse me. Pizzelles are usually relatively sturdy. Kruimkake, when done right, are very delicate. I remember growing up going to Swedish Society's Lucia Festival or kind of the Christmas potlucks, and all these old ladies would bring all their Scandinavian Christmas cookies, and the ones who brought Koekje would often crumple up wax paper and put it kind of around these little cones, the Koekje cone, that you wrap them around this cone when they're still hot, and they're not meant to be filled with anything. It's just decoration. But like if you dropped the Tupperware box or like moved it too quickly, they would all break, right? So you wanted to get them to the potluck intact, right? And then the Dutch also kind of have a similar thing, which waffler, right? We think of waffles today as being like the square or the Belgian style waffles, but historically they were much closer to pizzelles or Koekje, in that they're a very thin, embossed cookie, basically. Then the last one is sandbakkelse. The singular is sandbakken, which dates to the 1850s because that's when the baking tins were mass produced. They look like little shortbread tarts, but the texture is a little bit different from shortbread, and the tin is definitely a big part of it. So I have some pictures and recipes here. First, I got these all these recipes from a 1920s cookbook from North Dakota. That's where I'm from. So it delighted me to find this cookbook on Google Books called Recipes from Many Lands. And the Scandinavian dessert section is huge. So I thought I would reproduce some of the recipes for you here. I also love the phonetic spelling. So this is pepparkaka, right? It's pepparkaka is the Swedish word. A lot of these cookie recipes call for cream or sour cream. And then this one I love lists the spices, and it's got that black pepper in there. And a gallon of flour. I love that this is a big recipe. The cookies will keep and improve the older they get. And that's all the instructions you get as to how to make it. Very traditional, historic, particularly community cookbook recipes. You know, they think you know how to make these already, so they're just giving you the ratio and ingredients. Spritz get really popular post-war. I talked about before. In large part in the 1950s, there was a big interest in Scandinavian cooking, smorgasbord, things like that. And the cookie press gave us the Spritz cookie. Particularly in the 1950s, they become super popular outside of Scandinavian immigrant communities. But this is the 1920s, so we're still inside the cookies. This says shape into wreaths, right? Run through sprit cookie form. And also keep the dough very cold, right? Because Spritz can be extremely soft, and if it's too soft, the little stream of cookie dough will break coming out of the cookie press. Believe me, I know, I've done it. There were a million sandbakkelse recipes in here, 2 whole pages. So it's very similar to shortbread, except for it contains eggs. Most of them are pressed into tins. Some of them are rolled out, right? You can make it like more traditional Scottish style shortbread, where it's just a big pie pan of it, which is what this is calling for. Others are saying bake it in the little patty pans that it comes with. And then you do also see some anglicization of the name. Instead of sandbakkelse, you get sand tarts, which is almost a direct translation, and also gives you a little idea of the texture, right? They're kind of crumbly. This is what they look like. There's all different kinds of these beautiful molds. These are some of the more elaborate ones. There are some that also just like little tart tins. And they're traditionally not filled with anything, but if you would like to fill them with jam and whipped cream, which is what I did for a Scandinavian midsummer party I had this summer, I can recommend it. It's very good. And then Fatiman, I couldn't find a good picture of these, but they don't call for butter, they call for cream, right? They're made with cream and then deep fried, usually flavored with nutmeg. One of the few Scandinavian cookies that is flavored with nutmeg. And then Koekje or Koekje, right, depending on which Scandinavian language we're speaking, attributed to all 3 of the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. And then also I like this one. They're rolling theirs around a broom handle. And then this woman, it says, these cookies resemble ice cream cones, but are served as an ordinary cookie. Yeah, don't try and put ice cream in them. That's not what they're for. So that leads us to American Christmas cookies, right? So we have all of these your immigrant communities influencing what we're eating at Christmas time. But we get a very distinctly American style cookie as well. We have a couple that I'm going to talk about a little bit more in depth. We have peanut butter blossoms, Mexican wedding cookies, and then also just the more kind of generic cutout cookies. That's a very American thing to have these, you know, angels and drums and deer and things that are not just shapes, but are actually depictions of more complicated things, but only the cutout, right? Because they are designed to be frosted. So instead of the relief of a cookie mold, we're giving you just the outline of the cookie frosting and other decorations like colored sugar and sprinkles to tell you what it is, right? And of course, sugar cookies being the primary medium for these, again, are kind of more distinctly American style cookie. Peanut butter blossoms have a great backstory. They were entered by Mrs. Chester Smith. It's 1950s. We don't have first names when we're married women. In 1957, enters Peanut Blossoms as her entry for the bake-off. Pillsbury started the bake-off in 1949 as a way to promote Pillsbury flour and other products. It's still happening. Not quite as good in my opinion, because it's using a lot of like the more pre-made Pillsbury products instead of just the flour. But this is probably one of the most enduring recipes to come out of the bake-off. It did not win the Grand National Prize. You can see it has Grand National, but in the senior category. Nonetheless, it becomes hugely popular. And Hershey's ends up putting it on the Hershey Kiss bag, on the back of the Hershey Kiss bag. And after that, it really takes off in the late 60s and early 70s. It becomes ubiquitous. You see them everywhere. And I have a couple of theories for this. One is that it's not a very expensive cookie, right? You don't need butter. The original recipe calls for Crisco and peanut butter, right? That's the shortening there. And aside from Hershey Kisses, you don't need any fancy candied fruit or expensive nuts or even spices, right? You might not have 6 different spices in your spice cabinet to make gingerbread, but if you have peanut butter, you can make peanut butter blossoms, right? They're also super, super easy to make. Mrs. Chester Smith said that originally she wanted to put chocolate chips in her peanut butter cookies and for her kids or her grandkids, and she didn't have chocolate chips. She only had Hershey Kisses, so she did those instead. But they're super easy to make, and it's a quintessential American flavor combination of peanut butter and chocolate, right? Other countries do not eat peanuts like Americans do. They eat them in more savory applications. Americans were all about the sweet, which throws some people off. But yeah, so I think that's part of the reason why they get to be so popular. Then there's that one cookie that has a million names, right? It's kind of almost a universal cookie. I think it's probably Middle Eastern. I was trying to find the origins of it. They're a little murky, but there are a number of Middle Eastern cookies, particularly one called mamoul, which is very similar. It's a crumbly, buttery, nut-based cookie in a ball and rolled in powdered sugar, but mamoul has date paste in the middle of it. Usually made with almonds or walnuts, right, which are native to the Middle East. I think it came to the United States via Moorish Spain, right? So I think this style of cookie comes to Spain from the Arab tradition and then from Spain to Mexico, which is where pecans are native to. And one of the names is Mexican wedding cookie because it is very popular at Mexican weddings and because it is so delicious. The name Russian tea cake floats around every once in a while. I could not find any reference to either that name or this style of cookie being in any Russian cookbooks that I could find. Now, granted, I'm only reading the ones that have been translated, but I could not find any reference anywhere to this style of cookie in Russian culture. So my theory is that a Russian tea room made these cookies and somebody called them Russian tea cakes, and that's how that name stuck. We also get the name snowballs, particularly in the 1950s when we don't want to be talking about Russia, thanks to McCarthyism. So the name Mexican wedding cake or Mexican tea cake and snowballs really starts to take off in the 1950s. And then, of course, they are a relative, I don't know which one came first, of pecan standees, which are basically this cookie, but without the powdered sugar. So why do we leave cookies for Santa, right? That is part of our Christmas, American Christmas tradition, is we put out cookies and milk for Santa Claus. Where does that come from? So leaving treats for magical visitors around Christmas time is popular in a lot of countries. In Scandinavia, the little, somewhat Santa-ish elven house spirits, in Norway they're called Nisse, and in Sweden they're called Tomte, get a treat at Christmas time as a thank you for helping, you know, take care of the animals, make sure the farm is prosperous, make sure the house doesn't burn down, that kind of thing. So in Norway they get rømmegrøt, which is a very rich cream porridge with like part of the process of making it is the butter separates out from the cream. So you have like ladles of butter. It's usually served with cinnamon and sugar. Super delicious. And the Nisse has to get his share. Otherwise he might get mad and feel that you're ungrateful and leave. And then you would be without a household spirit watching over your house and your farm. Same thing in Sweden, except for they do rice pudding. So everybody in their family gets rice pudding and they leave rice pudding out on Christmas Eve for the Tomte. In Britain, Santa doesn't get treats, Santa gets sherry, which tells you how British parents feel about Christmas, right? After doing all the presents themselves, obviously, they leave sherry out for Santa, and I'm sure the parents are the ones who are actually drinking it. In Germany, kids leave out their Christmas letters, which I'm like, bold move on behalf of German parents to not know what's in those letters prior to Christmas. And then in the Netherlands, this is mostly for Sinterklaas on St. Nicholas Day, kids leave carrots and hay in their shoes for Sinterklaas's donkey or horse, depending on where you're from. Some people also do it with reindeer in other countries, right? And then in exchange for the carrots and hay, they get little treats and presents left in their shoes. But in the United States, we do cookies and milk. So there's some theory in the United States that this may have come out of the tradition of leaving out provisions for travelers around the holidays, particularly before we have railroads. Wintertime is actually the best time of year to travel. So not only do we have all these holidays that you're bringing friends and family together for, but people are traveling more in general because when the roads are frozen and there's snow, you can take a sleigh. Often rivers would freeze, basically making these nice flat broad highways. You can go super fast, right, on your horse-drawn sleigh, much easier to travel. But a time of year and a time period when we don't really have hotels, right? There's not really roadside inns that you can stop at. So you're just going to stop at anybody's house if the weather gets bad or you need to stop for the night. So that's one of the theories, is people would leave out provisions. The first print reference I could find dates to the 1870s, and it's a little girl expressing some skepticism that Santa is actually the one eating the milk or drinking the milk and eating the cookies, right? Which tells you that the tradition is probably older than that, but that was the first print reference I could find. So cookies obviously become Christmas traditions in other countries, but the United States, cookies are just ubiquitous here. So how did we go from being this rare medieval luxury to this inexpensive, ubiquitous treat in the United States? There's a couple of different reasons, things that are happening. So one is that we have some changes in agriculture in the 19th century. Refined white flour and refined white sugar get much more abundant and cheaper thanks to mechanization. We also have a chemical advantage, right? So we have chemical leaveners, which you see in a lot of American cookie recipes. One of the first references ever comes from Amelia Simmons' American Cookery book, published in 1796 in Hartford, Connecticut, and then again that same year in Albany. And we don't know that much about her, but one of the theories is that she was a Hudson Valley resident, in part because of the use of the word cookie and some other Dutch words, and also because she talks about pearl ash as a leavener. Pearl ash is a type of, it comes from potash or potash, and Albany in the late 18th century was one of the main hubs of potash manufacture in the United States. So it's a chemical leavener, an early one. Another early one is hartshorn or baker's ammonia. Sometimes you'll still see very old-fashioned sugar cookie recipes calling for baker's ammonia. Baking soda, which is great, but you need an acid to leaven it. So if you're not going to use buttermilk or even molasses, sometimes it's acid enough, you need cream of tartar, right, to leaven it, which is basically what baking powder is. It's already combined baking soda and cream of tartar. Our kitchen technology is also changing. We have more and more access to tinware, right? So we have cookie cutters and cookie sheets and cookie molds. We have much better access to stove technology, particularly into the 20th century when we start to get gas and electric stoves. That's giving us ovens, much more reliable ovens. And then refrigerators, right? Ice boxes and later electric refrigerators give us icebox cookies and slice and bake and the ability to chill our cookie dough, right? So that all plays a role too. Just a couple of images of early kitchens. This is a fairly typical American kitchen from around the 1840s. And you can see there's no bake oven. There's this big giant hearth. We have room. We probably could have put a bake oven in here, but there isn't one. There's a tin kitchen. So we're not making cookies. What are we making? We're making pie, because that is easy to make on an open hearth. A little bit later in the 1870s, we have this beautiful cast iron range. Whoops, excuse me. We have hot water. We have running water with our sink, right? Here's the coal scuttle, so we know it's a coal-fired range. Where's the oven? Maybe here? Is there one? Not super clear. So what are we making? We're still making pie. We're not making cookies. And then why do Christmas cookies become such a tradition in the United States? Part of it is our immigrant heritage, right? So a lot of us probably have immigrant traditions in our families around Christmas cookies. But as we get into the 20th century, our American foodways are kind of homogenizing, right? We're starting to get more national media. Our agriculture is becoming more and more accessible outside of regional areas. And then also we get things like this, which is the federal government told people that they should send Christmas cookies to the troops during World War II. So that kind of helped popularize the idea of Christmas cookies as an American institution. In the 1950s and 60s, a number of Christmas-related books and cookbooks were published, including the Betty Crocker cookie book, right, which is for all seasons, but a lot of Christmas cookies are in there. And then as we get into the latter half of the 20th century, we're starting to get third and fourth generation immigrants who are looking back to try and reclaim some of their immigrant heritage before it's lost, right? So the general rule of thumb is first generation immigrants are ashamed of their culture and try to assimilate. Second generation immigrants for sure do not want to be seen as other, so they try to distance themselves from their heritage. Third generation is usually the one that starts to say, hey, wait a minute, this is valuable. We should retain these cultural traditions, particularly around food and particularly around holidays. So that kind of gives us some revival of these traditional cookies. And then also the 1970s, we have the bicentennial, which gives us a huge interest in historic foodways, particularly cookies, right? And Christmas cookies. So what's the future of cookies look like? Do we know? I don't know. We have some theories though. There's a bunch of dietary impacts on whether or not people are eating cookies, right? Cookies are ubiquitous. You can go to any grocery store, you can go to any gas station and get mass-produced industrial style cookies. There's also a growing movement of people who want really fancy cookies, usually sugar cookies, usually the flooded, highly decorated, flooded with royal icing style cookies. I personally know of 2 people who actually their whole job now is they just have a professional cookie decorating company. Cookie swaps are maybe not as much of a thing as they used to be, particularly since people have less time and skill needed to bake some of these more complicated traditional recipes. Diet culture ruins everything, including Christmas cookies. Reject diet culture. And then people are also starting to examine, do we need these traditions that have been around for a while? Are they still serving us? So, do you think there's a future for Christmas cookies? That's the end of my talk. And it looks like we have some questions in the chat or some comments. Okay. Oh, yes, Eleanor. Okay, so for those of you who live in the Hudson Valley, there is a giant bake oven at the Rear Center for Immigrant Culture and History in Kingston. If you want to see what so that's a late 19th, early 20th century giant bake oven, super cool if you want to see them. Oh, Beth, you asked about jumbles. I did not include jumbles in my list. I'm sorry. We could talk about a million different Christmas cookies. There's so many I didn't talk about. So yeah, sorry, we didn't talk about jumbles. Oh yes, great comments. Yes, Karen, island people say biscuit. Island like in the Caribbean? That would not surprise me. There are British colonies down there. Megan, yes, shortbread does go very well with scotch. Yeah, Renee, also Scandinavian and grew up making krumkake. Oh, comb-shaped. Tell me more about comb-shaped. No, cone. Oh my gosh, sorry. I scrolled down and saw your correction. Yes, cone-shaped. Diane, Toll House cookie has its own whole separate story, not traditionally a Christmas cookie. Very popular. Toll House being our first chocolate chip cookies, right? Not a traditional Christmas cookie though, so I did not include them for that reason. Oh, Renee is Norwegian, grew up burning her fingertips making krumkake with her father. Oh, you have an authentic krumkake machine. Guess what? I have a krumkake iron too. I've just never used it. It's designed for an electric stove, which is what I have, but it's not cast iron, it's cast aluminum, so it's from the 1950s, but someday I'll find the time. Ooh, Carl, how much influence did marketing have on cookie making or Betty Crocker? That is a great question. Gosh, it's really interesting. If you look at 19th century cookbooks, there are not that many cookie recipes. It tends to be like there's a ginger cookie, there's some kind of sugar cookie shortbread, there's like a nut-based cookie or jumbles, right? We talked about jumbles. There's usually some kind of chocolate cookie, and that's it. It's really the 20th century that we start to get like this explosion of more everyday styles of cookies. So I think probably the marketing that had the most influence on cookie making was probably oven manufacturers doing the marketing, right? And also it just became, I think, more popular, particularly in the 1920s, and we get like slice and bake and drop cookies, so you're not having to roll them out and cut them out. So we do get the development of some more casual everyday cookies. But yeah, I think with the holidays, probably the biggest marketing is the manufacturers of ovens and things like, cookie cutters and things like that are having an influence on what types and styles of cookies people are making. Okay. Yes, getting ready for another cookie baking weekend. I did not get to do any cookie baking last weekend, despite my best intentions. But I'm hoping to get some done this weekend. My go-to cookie that I make is one influenced by my mother-in-law. Actually, it is like a filled pastry cookie that I shape into crescents, and it's filled with chopped walnuts and butter and sugar and cinnamon, baked in like a little unsweet pastry crust, and they are delicious. So they're easy to make and super popular every time I make them. They just fly off the plate. So that's usually the one that I manage to make. Oh, Renee's shrimp cracker machine is electric. I might have to go that route at some point. I did also I went home to North Dakota in August, and I brought home a lefse griddle. So that's also on my to-do list, is to try my hand at lefse for you Scandinavians out there. Okay, any other questions for me? Anybody want to unmute? Are we allowing that?
If you want to unmute and ask a question, you just have to raise your hand in the participants window, and I think I can manually unmute you if you do want to speak. I think you just answered everyone's questions by doing such a well done presentation, Sarah.
Too thorough, except for jumbles. Maybe I'll add that for next year.
Well, if there's no more other questions, I guess we'll say goodnight. Just a reminder, this is recorded, so if you want to check out some of the recipes that Sarah had shared in the pictures, you can definitely do that. So give me about a week or so, and I should have that video ready for you. But other than that, I think we're going to say goodnight. Merry Christmas. I'm having cookies after I get out of this because they all look so good. And I think that's it. So good night. Thanks again, Sarah.
All right. Thanks, Krista.
See everybody later. Good night.
Good night, everybody.